Okay, welcome to the Nick and Joe Show, folks. I'm Nick, and he's not Joseph. He doesn't have the beard for it.
No, I don't.
my guest host this evening with me is Chris Fraser. He's a former government employee up in Ottawa, and he is also a social commentator. And we have him fill in for Joseph once in a while, and does a great job. So it's good to see you again, Chris.
Good to see you, Nick. Thanks for inviting me on.
Well, you know what? When you've got a stable with two horses in it and one of them's lame.
Yeah. Am I the lame horse? Is that what you're saying?
No, Joseph is. He's not here tonight. So you're believe me, you're not second best. You're just as good as Joseph is, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. One of the things I thought, well, first of all, before I get into all that, I don't know about you, but up here in Sioux Lookout, it's been like 90 degrees for the last 4 or 5 days. What's the weather like down there?
It was very hot and sticky today, and you just reminded me of something. Speaking of hot and sticky, I was driving down Walkley Road towards my mom's place, going to have dinner with her tonight, and I don't know, I guess I thought of you because I said, I wish Nick was here, because out in Sioux Lookout, you probably don't see this as much as you see in the city of Ottawa. I'm driving down the road. I look to my right and I see a lady walking down the street with a mask on in this hot weather.
Believe it or not, there's still people. You know what? As I don't care. It doesn't bother me, because we have people up here too who it's almost like it's habit now. It's not, they just put it on. Okay, fine. I don't have a problem with that. If you want to walk around with a mask on in the dead of summer, when it's 95 degrees outside, knock yourself out. Just don't expect me to put one on,
Yep.
And the stores are fine. You can go into restaurants now, all that stuff. Nobody cares whether or not you're wearing a mask. But some people, maybe it's like Linus in his blanket. I don't know. But, it's a comfort thing for them.
If you're in a bus, and you say, okay, I'm still not comfortable maybe in a bus or a crowded area where there's lots of people around you, maybe in an elevator. Okay, that's fine. Even at this point, I'm not going to mock you for that. But you're walking down the street all by yourself, nobody around you, and you've still got this mask on.
Or if you're in a car with the windows rolled up.
Yeah. And a block later, after I saw that lady, I saw this young teenager. I wasn't sure if it was a guy or a girl. I think it was a girl, about 14 years old, and she's bouncing a basketball on the street, which is fine. And she had a mask on. And it's like, you're 14 years old, you're on the street with a basketball. Once again, hardly anybody around her on a hot, hot day. Why are you wearing a mask outside?
Well, look, again, it's an ingrained habit now. It's been 2 years, and people have just, it's like putting your shoes on when you walk out the door. It's just, I don't get it. I don't understand it, but there you go. And as long as the mandates are gone and that kind of stuff, like I can get travel, I can do what I want. I don't have to wear this useless mask. Then I don't care if somebody else wants. Like, they could dress up in a hazmat suit for all I care. I think they were a little silly, but that's it's supposed to be a free country. Although the government seems to be working really hard at erasing that part of the sentence, the free part. And by free, I don't mean cost. So yeah, we still have some of that going on up here, but for the most part, people in general have put that to bed. And even at church, the pews are all full now. The people are sitting next to each other, and it's when you go in on Sunday, then it works out just fine. And nobody comes up to you and says, "Hey, you don't have a mask on."
Yeah, no, there's still a few at my church who wear a mask, and that, once again, if you're in the building and you feel more comfortable having your mask on around people, that's fine. I'm not, going to say anything about that. But outside, when there's nobody around you,
I don't get it either. I don't get it either. Yeah. Now, I see Craig's joined us in the chat room. Hello, Craig.
Yeah, hi, Craig.
I wanted to get into this Bill C-11. So before I'm going to bring John on, because this really impacts YouTubers and people like John who host shows like this on his online radio station. There is a clip by Candice Bergen I think is relevant. So John, if you've got that ready, let's play that.
Morning. How are you?
I'm good. How's everyone?
You're good.
I want to
tell everyone that Conservatives believe Superintendent Darren Campbell, when he says that Brenda Lucky, the commissioner...
Okay, hold it, John. That's not the clip I thought it was. All right. That's for, we're going to talk about the police and the government in collusion about the gun violence out west, out east in Nova Scotia. So I had the right idea, wrong clip. So maybe you could just bring us up to speed on what this whole Bill C-11 was. I looked at it today, and it really does sound nefarious. I watched somebody who is a YouTuber with about 750,000 subscribers talk to a U.S. Canadian Senate hearing about the impact this is going to have on people like you and like him in trying to make a living on the internet.
So it's being sold to Canadians as a method of protecting you from bad things on the internet. And it's being sold to Canadians as leveling the playing field between traditional media outlets like your Bell Medias, your Rogers, your Chorus, your traditional TV, radio channels. So it's going to level the playing field by making sure that people who post to YouTube, etc., are having to play by the same Canadian content rules, for example. It's going to make sure that outside companies like Netflix, like Disney Plus, that they are paying into Canadian talent development funds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they can't pull out of it. They can't withdraw money from that, but they have to contribute to it in order to make sure that Canadians have an equal footing. That's how it's being sold. The challenge is, it is being left to the CRTC, which is the regulatory body. It's the Canadian Radio, Television, Communications Commission.
Organization.
Right. And there's really nothing in the language in Bill C-11 that defines, first off, what is Canadian content. It's really being left up to the CRTC to determine that. And just what are they going to enforce? So the challenge for someone like me, for example, and the content that I produce on Blast the Radio, which, look, I look at our operation and I go, well, okay, I have featured well over 100 local artists, music artists, on my radio station since we started. That's amazing. In 25 years in conventional radio, there's no way in hell I would have ever featured 100 local artists. Does that qualify me to be Canadian content? Lowell Green is on with me. You guys are on with me. Does that qualify as Canadian content? What defines Canadian content for people like me? And if we're not meeting this criteria, that nobody seems to know what the criteria is, the CRTC seems, under this bill, to be able to affect the algorithms, etc., so that when Canadians go searching for content like your show, it may not appear in their Google search at all. And it's this big gray area of undefined, power that the CRTC has been given to this that really scares people. We need the language on this. What is Canadian content for audio streamers? What is Canadian content for Facebook? Now, in addition to that, the language in the bill seems to indicate that no. And the government, of course, says, trust us, we're not going after Joe Q Public. You can still post on YouTube. You can still post on Facebook. Trust us, we're fine. We're more concerned with making sure that Facebook follows the regulations. They're the ones who will enforce it upon you, not us, is basically what it's going to come down to.
Okay, so I'll let Chris in on this in just a second, but the first thing that comes to mind is the law is only good as only any good if you can enforce it. So, because to me, it would seem that there's got to be workarounds around this, loopholes in it, that will be able to be exploited to thwart this law. The trouble is, we have this law in the first place. Like, the government, this is if we take the government's word at face value, which is a very dangerous and risky thing to do.
Right.
But let's say for the sake of discussion, they actually are authentic in what they say, because I don't believe that for a second. But let's say that they are, okay? I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. If that's true, do they not recognize that the internet is global and that Canadians are competing on a global stage, that we are up against people from all different corners of the world, from Ukraine to Florida to Venezuela to England to you pick the country. There's bloggers and video people up YouTube uploads how many millions of videos a day? It's ridiculous.
So they have been told this. Right. And it makes Canada one of the first nations in the world, certainly one of the first G7 nations, to have any sort of law like this. Like, we are alone on this island, and it is absolute censorship of the content that Canadians can access, that what you're allowed to produce, how much of it you're allowed to produce. Like, I can't even begin to explain the Canadian content regulations as they exist for what qualifies for Canadian content on television. I can speak to music because, with my radio background, that I'm abundantly familiar with. But we're in a situation with Canadian content for music. Okay, let me ask you guys. In your opinion, what is Canadian content as it pertains to music? Chris?
I would consider Canadian content anything that's if it's an artist who writes the song or performs the song, I would say that's qualifies as Canadian content. I guess it gets the line gets fuzzy if you're talking about what if you have a band of 4 guys and one guy's British, one guy's American, and 2 guys are Canadian. Is that a Canadian band?
All right, and we have a way of figuring that out. Okay, Nick, in your opinion, what would qualify as Canadian content as it pertains to music?
I would say any Canadian artist writing music either in or about Canada that is, that they perform publicly. So if you have a band, let's take Great Big Sea as an example, that would be Canadian content. If you look at Neil Young, okay, not that I like him, but he's originally a Canadian. Is he putting out Canadian music, or is he Americanized and making money off the American market?
So here's where it becomes a real mess.
Exactly what I'm driving at. There's some fuzziness around that.
So have you ever seen on CDs and albums, and we're all old enough to remember CDs and albums, you ever seen a stamp that looks like that?
If I did, I don't remember it.
So for the radio audience, it's a circle, and it's divided into 4 spaces. MAPL conveniently spells maple, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in order for a song, and it's based on a song, in order for a song to qualify as Canadian content, it must satisfy 2 out of 4 of those criteria. M being music, so the music must be written by a Canadian. Artist must be Canadian. Production, not producer. Production
must be done in Canada.
L is for lyrics, so lyrics must be written by Canadians. So you get into a situation like Chris mentioned where you've got a bunch of guys from different places. As long as they all agree that the majority of the song was written by a Canadian, okay, they'll get credit for lyrics and or music. But here's the thing. Remember when Bryan Adams marched his ass down to the CRTC offices in Gatineau a few years back and said, "Hi, I'm here because I understand you don't feel I'm Canadian. Explain to me, please, how I, Bryan Adams, am not Canadian." And as it happened with his music, it didn't qualify as Canadian content. Oh, he does. The artist is Canadian, but the music was not written by a Canadian. The production was not done by a Canadian. The lyrics were not done by a Canadian, therefore not Canadian content. So we're punishing our artists who go on to great success.
So let me give you an example of, let's say, one of the most iconic Canadian songs there is Snowbird by Anne Murray.
Yep.
Now, some people have never heard of her or her song, but believe me, for years, that was, if you wanted to write a song that you couldn't get more Canadian than that. So we find out later that Anne sang it, but she did it in San Francisco.
Right.
It was written by a Brazilian and produced in England.
Not Canadian content.
See, just blows my mind.
And this is what happened with Celine Dion. So there's
another example.
She records a song. She, as the artist, is Canadian. She works with David Foster as the producer.
Mm-hmm.
There's your 2 out of 4, right? Oh, no, wait. David Foster is working out of Los Angeles. or New York. No production credit on the song.
Well, that's
what
for all the. That's
what does
for the
David
music
Foster do?
industry.
What does David Foster do? Everything, of course, is on computer, right? He sends his audio settings to someone in Vancouver and says, here, run this through your computer. There. Now it's Canadian content.
Oh, my God.
So Pat Benatar's Hit Me With Your Best Shot.
Yeah.
Big song, right?
Yep.
Why do you only hear that song from Pat Benatar? Because she had so many other hits.
She did.
It's Canadian content. Doesn't that make you feel Canadian when you hear Pat Benatar?
I didn't even know she was Canadian.
She's not.
She's not Canadian. No,
Oh, my
she's not.
But the song is. Meanwhile, Bryan Adams is not. This is my point. So what the hell is going to define Canadian content on the internet? I don't know. Someone at the CRTC has the power and the authority to arbitrarily decide what is and what isn't. And that's what scares the hell out of content producers like us when this bill comes
So
to
unless you're Gordon Lightfoot.
You've got me worried now, John, because I'm a CFL football fan and most of the players are American. So does that mean that the CRTC might ban
broadcast of games because they don't have their 40%?
Yeah.
You know who I found out played in the Canadian? He played for the Calgary Stampeders. Was The Rock?
Yeah,
I did not know that. I was watching
Oh.
him give a motivational speech to the LA Lakers, and he mentioned his time. He was a down linesman playing in the CFL for $250 a week.
Well, that's why the CFL got into conversations with him and the XFL, because he has this great love, especially for Wally Buono.
Yeah.
And his time in the CFL. He's got great memories of the CFL. Loves the game here.
Well, it's a great game.
But
if the Americans ever expanded that, and we're getting off track, but if the Americans ever expanded their football fields to 110 by 60 and went to 3 downs, you'd forget all about 4-down football.
I don't see.
Because then you'd have the best game played by the best people. I'm sorry. I believe that completely.
Chris, I'm with you. You know I'm a CFL nut, but that's never going to happen.
I know it's not going to happen. Too many fields are already built to 100 by 50. You'd have to tear down.
Guys, is what problem is the government trying to solve? The government is always in implementing laws to solve problems. Well, where is the problem?
So that
the internet's
Chris,
been around for 20 years.
Exactly. So Chris, thank you. That's exactly the point that I'm trying to make. So here I am cranking out as much Canadian content as I can. So my on-air radio venture is part and parcel. It stems and is combined with another business that I run, which has been online since 1996, and it's Canada's foremost. It's the number one go-to website for radio and TV job postings and industry news. So what I offer to broadcasters is a place to hang their hat if they're between gigs, a place to try out their show if they're looking to develop something. Who else is offering that in conventional radio? Like 100% of what I do, as far as I'm concerned, is celebrating Canadian talent as far as on air is concerned. It's offering opportunity to grow production, writing, on air, etc. But I don't know where I stand in this bill. And this bill was, of course, rushed. Why? Why? Like Chris says, this was not like we're solving a problem that doesn't exist.
This is when we go ahead. Sorry, I don't mean to jump in, but I'm going to jump in.
It's your show, and I'm not normally heard on this show, so I get a little riled up.
But I think when I said earlier that believing them is a very dangerous idea, if we take them at face value, you're running a great risk. This is why I don't believe them. This is why I don't believe them for a second, because A, it's rushed. B, as Chris just pointed out, what's the need? This is one of the greatest
rushed and then passed in the House of Commons, third reading in the middle of the night.
Yeah, well, they did it so that there will be no time to garner up any real resistance to it. And again, Yangmi Singh could have done something about this. He won't, just like he won't do anything about the whole RCMP boondoggle that we're going to get into later. He didn't want to bring the government. I mean, when does it? Okay, that's a separate issue, but to get back to what I'm trying to say, this is not about protecting Canadian content. I mean, everything we've just talked about makes that perfectly clear. This is about regulating what you can see and who puts it out. In other words, let's say you're a fan of Fox News, okay? And I must admit, I really love Kevin Gutfeld. I love his sense of humor.
Greg Gutfeld.
Is it Greg? Sorry, Greg.
Yeah.
Greg I think he's got the biggest talk. He has the biggest late night TV talk show in history. He has over 2 million views a night. So this guy, he does some amazing work, and I really admire the way he does it. But my point is, if the CRTC says, I'm sorry, that's fake news, or we don't like what he says, because guess what? He talks about us sometimes, as do a lot of people down in the States. They're talking about the kind of authoritarianism that's going on up here. Well, guess what? They may cut off our ability to access that.
Absolutely.
And that is a huge problem. This is
because he's not Canadian enough. The algorithms can be affected. That'll spiral him so far down in a Google search in any Canadian ISP.
Well, Tucker Carlson the same way.
Find him. Yeah,
Hannity the same way. You what's his name? Not Ben Shapiro, and there's other Mark Levin, and all these American commentators who talk about Canada, and they don't do it in flattering terms because there's nothing to be flattering about with this government.
Which is neither here nor there as far as I'm concerned. I just want the right to be able to see what's out there. That's the point of the internet.
Well, we're the best self-regulators there are.
And as a Canadian, I listen to a number of podcasts. I'm a big fan of Matt Walsh. I don't know if you guys ever listened to him. I like Michael Knowles, but I also am a fan of some of the Canadian podcasters. Like I love Andrew Lawton of True North, for example. It's a great podcast. Candace Malcolm. So I don't differentiate between American and Canadian. I mean, I want a balanced worldview. Sometimes I'll listen to the BBC, or the Great Britain has a new podcast station. Even Sky News from Australia, they have.
Oh, they're great. I really like them.
They're great, but I don't want the government regulating what streams onto my computer. I don't want
them. But the priority, Chris, will be given to Canadian podcasts, as they deem them to be Canadian.
The only thing we're going to be allowed to see, if this is allowed to run rampant and taken to an extreme, is porn and gambling, and maybe sports. Everything else will be filtered out.
I don't think they're going to filter it. I think what it is, they'll play with the algorithms. But if there's someone that you like if you like Fox News, well, you can find Fox News on YouTube, but you'll have to look for it yourself. You have to know it's there.
Because they can go to your internet provider and they can affect whether it's displayed and available or not.
Oh, okay. So
if they're not pushing through enough Canadian content, then stuff like Hannity, etc., drops further and further and further and becomes harder and harder. You would have to have a friend in the States email you a direct link to be able to watch it. You know how you already log on to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, etc., and a lot of times you'll go to click on a video. Sorry, this is not available in your country right now.
Yeah, right.
That's ready for a whole world of that.
So, what does that mean to a group like Rebel News, Ezra Levant?
Not good news.
You can't say he's not Canadian.
The CRTC is right. It means the CRTC is going to sit there and go through it with a fine-tooth comb arbitrarily and decide whether or not it's worthy of Canadians having access to it or not.
Misinformation. What they're going to say is, they're putting out misinformation on this and misinformation on that. So therefore, we can't allow the Canadian public to see misinformation. So
that's
you go.
The risk. Without it being defined and in writing, that is the risk. And that is the question mark that all of us producing content on the internet, not just me, average Joe who posts to TikTok or Instagram or YouTube.
Okay, so I think Craig is quite right in this comment. That means they're done.
Pretty much.
Because, the only other thing I think I can think of is new platforms like Rumble and places like that, maybe beyond the reach of CRTC. There's always got to be a workaround. What if you use Skynet, Elon Musk's internet service, Skylink,
Time will tell, right? Time will tell.
Time will tell, because that's all satellite based. That's not through an internet provider.
I mean, my question is, so my studio, I'm based in Ottawa.
Yep.
But my audio server isn't in Canada. My video server, I don't know where my video server is right now. So at what point does it?
I think it's downtown Bangladesh, I think.
But I mean, like, what part of all these little jumping off points. Like, is it my point here in my studio? Is this where it's determined to be Canadian content, or do we? Because you can't have authority over, an audio server in England or in Australia or whatever else. They don't have that jurisdiction, but they do have the jurisdiction to Rogers, Bell, Tech Savvy, whoever you're getting your internet service from, to regulate them. That hey, we don't show this in Canada.
You would think that Rogers, Bell, Tech Savvy, ExploreNet, you name the company, they would be up in arms about this.
No, because it's to the benefit of your traditional terrestrial broadcasters.
Yeah, but
they're at a disadvantage right now.
Tech Savvy, as an example, is not a traditional broadcaster. Neither is ExploreNet.
No, they're not. They're a service provider. You're right.
So
now Tech Savvy tends to get up in arms a lot.
They should.
And they do, because they go head to head with Bell and Rogers all the time. They fight.
Well, as a matter of fact, that's who's providing my internet right now is Tech Savvy.
Me too.
So, but I think Chris.
But for companies like Bell and Rogers and Chorus, who own traditional TV and radio, their properties are are suffering. I don't want to say they're in trouble, but they're certainly seeing.
Unless you're CNN.
They're experiencing a loss, if you will, by people turning in, or turning on to web streams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the ones that are, getting the most damage. So people like me would now have to get a license, would have to pay into Canadian content funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all pooled so that I would end up basically helping to subsidize Bell and Rogers and Chorus so that they can develop their Canadian content as well. Puts us all on a level playing field in kumbaya.
Yeah, doesn't that work well? Wait a minute. No, it doesn't.
The real problem here is most Canadians don't really understand. I mean, and just till a few minutes ago, I didn't understand the when John explained that they could actually arrange it so you can't even get the feeds that you want. How many Canadians are really aware of that? Most Canadians aren't, so they're not really tuned into this problem at all.
Well, Nick and I were talking about that off the air, and I've talked about it at length on the air with Lowell. I really believe that most Canadians, they're just so disengaged now. They're so uninterested in any of this. This is how it's happening. They're not paying attention, and they don't want to pay attention. And it's only after this is shoved down their throats that they're going to be sitting there looking at their computers going, why can't I watch Hannity? What's going on?
Yeah. Well, I think this is part of the consequences that are going to lead to the downfall of this government, because everybody has a limit. Now, we started to see hitting some of those limits in January with the truckers' protest, who turned out that there's been a recent decision by the courts that the truckers were completely within their rights to do what they did. That's a very short synopsis of a very long decision, but that's, from what I gather, that's what the judge said. So, you're starting to see Canadians go, wait a minute. Now, it'll take a little while because you've got, and forgive me for saying so, but you've got the city. It's the people who live in this little bubble in downtown Toronto or downtown Edmonton or downtown Victoria, who just want to be to live their life. They like their progressive attitudes, and they're not connected to the ground. There's no grounding in their lives because they don't know anything about how the real world works. They have this perception they do, but as a friend of mine or a famous world leader would say, it's not that the liberals are wrong. There's just so much they know that isn't so. And that's, a very famous Ronald Reagan quote. This is where it comes home to roost. You have people out there who think they know what's going on, but haven't got a clue because they won't lift their head out of the red bucket they've got their head buried in long enough to draw a clean breath. And with that, we're going to take a break.
All day.
Go ahead. Finish up your thought there, Chris.
So you don't have to listen to, 8 hours of news a day to be informed, but just even 45 minutes, an hour, just to keep yourself up to date. That's all I ask.
43% voter turnout in the last Ontario election. If you don't think people are not engaging in what's happening in government, that's all you need to look at. And the municipal election coming up in Ottawa and in Ontario, you're going to have 30% if you're lucky.
Yeah, but part of that is because the better the devil I know than the devil I don't. And people thought, in case of Ontario, Doug Ford's going to win a landslide, so why should I go out and vote? What difference does my vote make? They don't understand that voting in and of itself is part of our civil duty.
Exactly. They're not paying attention, and they're not
Precisely.
aware of the difference their vote can make.
All right. With that, we'll take that break. When we come back, we might talk a little bit about gun control. We'll be right back with more on the Nick and Joe Show right after this.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
Okay, welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show, folks. I'm Nick. He's not Joseph.
I'm Chris. Right
He's
here.
Chris. Chris is a former government employee and a social commentator who joins us once in a while as a guest host, and we're always glad to have him. All right. Well, that was an interesting half hour. There was a lot in that. I certainly hope that people listening gleaned a lot of useful information out of that. This is why we need to pay attention as much as it's a pain in the neck. I'm a news junkie, so it's like a habit or a hobby for me, but not everybody's wired like I am, thank God. We'd all be in trouble. But at the same time, you got to pay attention, whether you find it boring or just, oh, I'm so sick of this. Believe me, there's days when I do not want to look at it either, but you have to. And the reason you have to is so stuff like this that we just spent half an hour talking about doesn't happen. So with that said, I'm going to roll into the next story, which is about the mass shooting in Nova Scotia. Let me share a couple paragraphs out of a story from the Halifax Examiner. I'm just going to read you just a couple quick paragraphs, and then I'm going to play that clip about Candace Bergen. And she's going to talk about why they don't believe the commissioner of the RCMP. They believe the superintendent, but I'll let her explain that. But here's just a couple quick paragraphs. RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki made a promise to Public Safety Minister Bill Blair and the Prime Minister's office to leverage the mass murders of April 18th and 19th, 2020 to get a gun control law passed. A week after the murders, Lucky pressured the RCMP in Nova Scotia to release details of the weapons used by the killer, but the RCMP commanders in Nova Scotia refused, saying to do so would threaten their investigation into the murders. One more quick paragraph, and then we'll go to the clip. The Trudeau government's gun control objectives were spelled out in an order in council issued in May of that year and were encapsulated in Bill C-21, which was tabled last month. But the concern in April 2020 was the extent to which politics threatened to interfere with a cross-border police investigation into how the killer managed to obtain and smuggle into Canada 4 illegal firearms used to commit many of the 22 murders. Okay, so with that said, let's hear from Candace Bergen and what she thinks about who she believes in all this.
Hi, how are you?
And I'm good. How's everyone?
We're good.
I want to tell everyone that Conservatives believe Superintendent Darren Campbell, when he says that Brenda Lucki, the Commissioner, pressured the RCMP, and the reason she did it was because she had made a commitment, or she had been pressured by the Prime Minister's office and or the Public Safety Minister's office. We believe Superintendent Campbell. This is disgusting to know that the Prime Minister and his office would use the death of Canadians for his own political gain, but unfortunately we have seen it before. We believe very strongly the Prime Minister, his office, and the Minister of Public Safety's office, and the Minister of Public Safety, the former minister, have to be held accountable. We will make sure that that happens. Now, right now, they are denying wrongdoing. This is a pattern. This is what this Prime Minister does. You will recall with SNC-Lavalin, the Globe broke the story, and the Prime Minister looked in the camera and said, I did not pressure the Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould. We know now that was not true. So when the Minister of Public Safety looks in the camera and says, I did not pressure the Commissioner, it's very, very difficult to believe that. So we're going to hold them accountable and get to the bottom of what happened.
How are you going to do that? Are you thinking about a
summer
committee?
We believe there needs to be a full investigation. If the Minister and the Prime Minister have nothing to hide, they'll hide nothing. They will be completely transparent, not be hiding documents, not be hiding emails, or hiding behind cabinet confidence.
So the Commissioner of the RCMP is no shrinking violet. No Commissioner of the RCMP has ever been a pushover. So surely, is she not acting in her own actions?
Surely it would appear from what the superintendent said, surely she wasn't. So she'll have to answer for that. But at the end of the day, it's the Prime Minister and the Minister of Public Safety. The Prime Minister has a habit of doing this, using people, using his influence for his own political gain and interfering in criminal investigations, and in this case, an investigation into the biggest mass killing in Canadian history. One more question, then I've got
What do you think it says about the culture of this government? Brenda Lucki is saying she wasn't under any specific direction, but the note suggests at minimum she felt that she was. So there was a sense that she had a political responsibility, whether or not PM told her, Blair told her. She had that ticking around in her head. What do you make of that?
It's what we've seen previously happen in this government. And we see the Prime Minister continually use challenges that Canadians are facing, big challenges in this country, whether it was the convoy and the protesters and vaccines, to divide, wedge, and stigmatize Canadians, whether it was SNC-Lavalin, whether it's many of his own failings, he uses it and tries to turn it on Canadians. And I think that this is just a pattern that we've seen. And he denies, and then he blames. Deny, deflect, and blame. So this is one more question, Ian, and then that's all.
How should this be investigated? Is it inquiries? How should we get on this? What's the best way?
I think my concern, I think committees would be good. However, we have seen the NDP help cover up a lot for the Liberals. So I really have concern about a parliamentary committee because the habit is, first of all, the Liberals have the majority, they're going to cover up, and now they have the majority with the NDP. So I think there has to be more independence and the ability for more of an independent investigation to happen. I don't trust the NDP to not cover up for the Liberals.
Okay, so that was Candace Bergen sharing her views on this whole mess. And you know what? She makes some very good points. I don't know if you've seen this before, Chris, but do you trust the commissioner of the RCMP when she says, oh no, there was no political interference here or no political meddling going on?
I find it hard to believe that she wasn't pressured. Brenda Lucki, it's interesting. She's been the RCMP commissioner for a couple of years. And I remember a few years ago, this will lead into a topic actually we might discuss later in the show, when they asked her if there was systemic racism in the RCMP, and she hesitated And she says, no, I don't think there really is. And then the next night she's on the news apologizing, saying, yes, there is racism in the RCMP. It's like, well, you said you didn't think so one night, and then the next night you do. So obviously somebody tapped her on the shoulder and said, oh yeah, you better, this is the line, this is the narrative here, stick with the narrative. So in this case, I'm pretty sure that she was pressured. I have no proof, but just based on past experience, what we've seen in the past, the PMO seems to have a way of pressuring people to toe the line.
You see, I think one of the things that matters here is that Canadians are supposed to have confidence in their police forces, plural, to be at arm's length from the government. Yes, the government appoints the head of the RCMP, as Chris points out. But at the same time, and by Chris, or Craig, Craig in the chat room, he's right. They are appointed by the Prime Minister, but that does not mean that they have to be beholden to his every whim and wish. They're supposed to be appointed because they're the best people for the job to maintain that arm's length distance, so that when an investigation happens, they're like Lady Justice. They put on a blindfold to as far as who you are, what you represent, or what your position is. Okay, so if it's a government official that's caught committing a crime, they get slapped in irons and taken and stood before a judge, just like you and I would. That's the heart of our Canadian system. And it's not much different than the American from that perspective. You know, you have to have Lady Justice as blind, otherwise you have no justice at all. And I think that what's going on here is Trudeau wanted to be able to pass this total handgun ban, which in and of itself makes no sense, because the firearms, the handguns in the hands of the average Canadian who's gone through all the training, got the restricted restricted firearms. I want to call it an acquisition. It's a PAL, a restricted purchase and acquisition license. Okay. Gone through all the training, has to notify the RCMP or the local police about when he's taking it to the range. All these different conditions have all been met. Those are not the firearms that are killing people. It's the ones coming over the borders being used by gangs. Those are the ones. So to legislate laws about an inanimate object instead of legislating penalties for people who use those inanimate objects in a way that is detrimental to their neighbor, and gangland shootings and drive-by shootings and all that kind of stuff are certainly detrimental. It's a defiance of reality. You can pass all the laws you want on a 45 Colt, okay, and it won't hurt anybody until somebody picks it up and uses it.
Right.
You can have no laws around it, and the same thing would be true, because it's not a sentient being. It doesn't think. It only acts in the way that the user uses it, like a car. Like a car won't run somebody over unless somebody in this driver's seat actually directs it to. That's why we have vehicular manslaughter, but the car doesn't go to jail.
I've been on this earth about the same amount of time as you, Nick, and growing up as a kid, as a teenager, a person in 20s, 30s, 40s, I've never really spent a lot of time worrying about guns. I don't walk down the street being worried that I'm going to be shot by somebody or an innocent bystander in a shooting. It could happen at any time, anywhere. I realize that, but the gun problem in Canada is not what the government makes it out to be. It tends to be in the big cities, and everybody in Canada knows that Toronto and Vancouver are like the main problem areas when it comes to guns. And even then, if you live in Toronto, if you're not wandering the streets late at night in a sketchy neighborhood, you're not likely to be attacked by anybody with a gun. Once again, it could happen anywhere, but if the gun problem is that terrible, why didn't the Prime Minister enact these regulations when he first became Prime Minister? Because he was elected in 2015. He was fortunate enough to win 2 more elections after that. And now he waits until 2022 to bring in these harsh bans. He could have done that back in 2015. Was there no gun crime back in 2015 when he was elected? Of course there was. But he's winning now because it's virtue signaling, as Craig says in the comments. The time is right. Like, oh, there's a shooting in Nova Scotia, and then the latest one is the school shooting in Texas. And what an opportune time to say, hey, I'm going to be the knight in shining armor here and protect you all from the next mass shooting by banning guns. You should have done that 7 years ago if you want to protect the public.
Well, first of all,
It doesn't wash.
what most people don't realize is that firearms, especially handguns, have been, for all intents and purposes, banned since 1932. This is not new. We do not have a gun violence problem. We have a gang problem. We have a drugs problem. We have all kinds of problems. Firearms are used in the commission of crimes by these people. So if you want to reduce violence by death or injury by firearms, deal with the people who are using them. Like the average, Chris, I would have no trouble taking a rifle or a pistol to a range with somebody like you. Okay? Go through the training, go to a range where it's safe. You've got a backstop, you've got a target, and maybe you enjoy poking holes in pop cans with a 22. The point is, neither one of us is going to be a threat to the public or the people around us. We're not the people they're worried about, or at least they say they're worried about. It's the people who don't care about the law. And that old saw, criminals don't register their guns, is just as true today as the first day it was put out there. That's true. Look, if I'm worried about carrying 2 keys of coke over the border, okay, and I've got a 45 and tucked in the back of my pants down my belt, do I care about the gun laws? No.
Right. Yeah.
You know what they're doing now in the southern states? They're using drones to fly firearms over the border. How long before that comes a problem up here? Because if people want them, especially people who don't care about laws, they'll find ways to get them. It's why prohibition didn't work. We don't learn anything from history in this country.
Yeah. And you talk about the southern states. It's like spent a fair amount of time in Florida the last year and a half. And, even walking around the community I spend time in Florida, I felt very safe. I wasn't worried about people with guns. Just kind of go out and do what you want to do. And I never ever felt worried that I was going to get shot by somebody. But once again, in Florida, the laws are tough. Like, yeah, people have guns down there, but if they're caught using guns, they have a governor who has a zero tolerance for criminals, and especially criminals who use guns. So, as you rightly said, it's not the guns. It's like, what do we do with people when we find them with the guns? How do we, what do we do when they are caught using guns? And if you make the penalty stiff enough, that'll be a disincentive to ever use a gun again if the penalties are stiff enough.
Well, if I was running the country, and maybe there's problems with this idea, but let me float it and you tell me whether you think it's a good idea or not. If Canadian law was written in such a way that anyone who uses a firearm in the commission of offense gets 20 years with no chance of parole right off the top, and then they're sentenced for the assault and or murder that comes with it. In other words, they spend the rest of their life in jail. That, I think, would put a big dent in, because what are the penalties now? 2 to 5 and you're out.
Yeah.
And just because they say, oh, you're not allowed to have firearms. Oh, right. Like the ones I wasn't supposed to have before, that kind of stuff. We have to take this seriously, or more people are going to die no matter what Trudeau does. And this is why the sooner this man leaves and we get some common sense back in on Parliament Hill, the safer we're all going to be.
I was watching the news a few nights ago at my mom's place, and there was a story of a shooting in Toronto, and they were interviewing the Toronto mayor, John Tory, not one of my favorite politicians, but he was talking about the shooting, and he says, you know what? Guns are a problem, but we also have to be tougher with these criminals. We have to put them in jail for a long time. We're too soft on the criminals. And I thought, wow, for once, John Tory said something that I really agree with, and he's the mayor of the biggest city in the country, and he should know. So why aren't the Liberals listening to people like John Tory when he says, let's get tough on the criminals?
Well, first of all, I think it was just window dressing to appease his voters. And he may have I don't know this for a fact, but he may have gotten a phone call from some place not in Toronto, maybe a bit northeast of the city, on top of a particular hill, saying, "Don't ever say that again. That is not part of the narrative. Don't you ever say that again, or I'll cut your funding to your city."
Well, I hope he was sincere about what he was saying, because
well, the proof is in the pudding. What's changed since he said it?
Right.
So that's my attitude about that. I don't like John Tory for a lot of the same reasons you don't. He's just too much a liberal. I don't care what color flag he flies. I look at the actions, and there's nothing conservative about anything that John Tory's doing lately. Certainly not in the last few years. And even if he did have a momentary spasm of common sense, that's long since flushed out the system, and he's gone back to drinking the red Kool-Aid again. And it's unfortunate, because the people of Toronto, of his own jurisdiction, are paying the price for that, even if they don't recognize it.
Yeah, and I don't know how many guns there are in Canada right now, but I'm pretty sure if I were able to search my little neighborhood right now, I'm not even sure if I'd find one gun in the 140 condos in my area. There are probably maybe one or two, but I don't think most of my neighbors are packing heat in their bedroom drawer. It's like, so it's not really that much of an issue. And don't forget, there's people who live in the rural areas who have coyotes and all kinds of wild animals that could come onto their property. And once again, how many times do you hear of mass shootings in rural areas like where you live? It's like it doesn't happen.
The only time it happened, there was once in the 22 years I lived in the Ottawa Valley. And that was a guy who never should have been let out of jail. What's his name? Last name is Barutsky. I don't want to tar the whole Barutsky family, but I can't think of his first name. But he took a hunting rifle, went around and shot 4 women. But that is so outside the norm. For all intents and purposes, that was a one-off. The guy was a lunatic to begin with, and should never have been let out of prison. And the parole board who let him out should be held accountable for it, but they never were, of course.
Yeah.
So, that's the only exception that I can hear of. There's accidental shootings once in a while, but that's about it. Certainly people don't walk around blowing each other away with whatever's at hand.
We have a comment here from Woodenhead. It says, "I don't need a gun. Us farmers, truckers are mean enough. We'll insert the bullets manually." I don't want to tangle with that guy.
No. Yeah, don't ever mess with somebody who says that. He probably means it.
Yeah.
But you know what? And the sad part is, it robs us of part of our heritage. We all talk about the gun culture in the United States. And the truth is, there's a gun culture here in Canada too. It just never gets talked about. I mean, if you go back to the original, all the way back to the settlement of Quebec City in 1604, there have been firearms here since Columbus, even before that, or Jacques Cartier. Okay, they brought firearms with them.
Right.
And it's only in the last 40 or 50 years there's been a problem. So what changed? Because we've had automatic and semi-automatic weapons since before World War I, over 100 years ago. What's different now? It can't be the access to firearms. It has to be the culture.
It's the culture. And you know what? Another guy that I very rarely agree with, but he's starting to, he makes sense. You know what I say? If a person makes sense, I don't care whether they're on the left or the right, as long as they make sense. And comedian / commentator Bill Maher in the United States, he is very left-wing. Everybody knows that. But check out his latest commentary on violence and guns. It is an excellent, excellent commentary. And he shows scenes, like movie scenes, of guys getting their heads blown off. And he says, how come we're always attacking guns but we never attack the Hollywood culture, which glamorizes vengeance and guys getting blown away because I have a grudge against you. So here I come. I'm going to blow your head off. I mean, that is so much a part of so much of the Hollywood movies, and no one ever talks about that. Nobody says, are we raising a culture? Even if there's only one kid in 100,000 who is affected by that, that could have been the kid in Texas. You know, what kind of entertainment was he involved in? Probably that kind of entertainment.
Well, I don't want to blame it all on video games and movies and so on, but I think you're right that you're overwhelmed with this unrealistic sense of what firearms are, what they can and cannot do. The worst place to go to for information about firearms is Hollywood. I mean, how many gunfights have I seen on movies? Because I like an action flick. You know, right. I've watched Band of Brothers. I've watched a bunch of narc shows. I watched, the latest Maverick movie, although they didn't use firearms in that other than the jets themselves. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen a gunfight from, 50, 60 yards away with a pistol, and they're dropping people with headshots. Yeah. You can't hit the broadside of a barn from 50 yards away with a pistol. I don't care how good it is. That's right. They're just wildly inaccurate beyond 20 yards. So there's a whole false understanding of what these things are. And it's part of the problem with drive-by shootings. They're so inaccurate that the bullets fly all over the place. Yeah. And anyway, the point I'm making is don't go to Hollywood for that. But to get back to the Canadian culture, we have within our culture a rich hunting culture. It's one of the great ways to experience the great outdoors: hunting, fishing, camping, all these things, an appreciation for nature. Okay? Because if you're a duck hunter or a moose hunter or a deer hunter, the last thing you want to do is shoot everything in sight. Because what are you going to hunt next year? They're the best conservationists we have because they understand the impact of what they're doing. And they also know that, especially with predators, we have a problem. I wish I had time to tell the whole story. I'll tell it real quick. There's a bear that comes out in the middle of the road just south of Sioux Lookout at a place called Butterfly Lake. And it's only a yearling. It's by itself. It's only about 3 feet tall, might weigh 60, 70 pounds. And this bear walks out in the middle of the road, and there are far more people than you would ever think stop and feed this bear in the middle of the road, thinking it's cute. Now, what's going to happen? This bear is going to grow up. It'll be 6 feet tall, 250, 300, 400 pounds, and looking for a snack handed out. And if you don't have one and he thinks there's one in your car, he'll just rip the window out of your car and crawl in there with you. So they're creating a problem with this animal that's going to end up with the animal being destroyed because people don't understand what animals are. And that is because we've gotten away from our agrarian roots and from our hunting culture. You never see a hunter do that. Not one that's respectable, not one that the vast majority of people who are hunters understand that kind of behavior will get somebody killed. Whether it be the bear, well, that's the least bad option, or somebody the bear's trying to get food from. And I can't tell you how many times it just drives me out of my mind when I see that, because you're putting life at jeopardy because, you're going to have to deal with this bear. And better do it when it's small than when it's big. So, and effectively, they're signing the bear's death warrant.
Right.
And it's all because people, in large part, have gotten away from hunting and don't understand what these animals are. And that's part of our culture as well. I mean, look at the fur trade. Look at the, what the natives used to do once they got firearms and they were out west hunting buffalo. They didn't have to run them off a cliff anymore. They could shoot them. So, anyway.
Exactly.
With that, I have to take a break because guess what time it is? Time for our top of the hour break. Well, you guys go get your beverages refreshed, and we'll be right back. Chris and I will be back after this on the Nick and Joe Show.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
Okay, welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show, folks. Chris is our guest host this evening. He's joined me to to discuss a bunch of important topics, and just leaving that last topic. First of all, I think that was an important topic that people need to understand. John made a comment off stage, so to speak, that the shooting in Nova Scotia was very rural. Yeah, it was, but the response was Ottawa centered. It wasn't, the locals weren't the ones that were trying to pass a law to strip people of their right to self-defense, in other words, or to own private property, especially law-abiding citizens. So it was a reaction. I think that this commissioner should be stripped of her position and possibly charged with interfering with police investigation, and the government should resign en masse. Now, they won't, because Yang Mead Singh will prop them up, and the Liberals will, under no circumstances, resign for anything they've done. And there are plenty of examples of where they should have resigned, all the way back to SNC-Lavalin. They should have resigned over that. But they don't care about ethics. They don't care about morals. They care about power. So as long as that's true, they're not going anywhere. So the ball is kicked over to Yang Mead. What's he going to do about it? Nothing. He's going to offer some platitudes about outrage, but he'll still support them. So he's as guilty as they are.
Yeah. And, before we move on to another topic, it's Canada and the United States are two different countries, but there are similarities. You look at cities like, Chicago, for example, where I'm sure this weekend there will be like 5 or 6 gangland murders, and they don't do anything about that. And then they always blame the guns. Oh, we got to get the guns off the street. No, you get the criminals off the street, and then that'll solve the problem.
Yeah, and I think Woodenhead made a good point too, and this is a big part of it. And I wish he makes a good point, so let me bring it up. He said the decline of the two-parent family is also a factor, and I think he's right. Now, we could spend 2 hours talking about that, but in a nutshell, not having a father figure in the house where young boys, because for the most part, these are the young people who are shooting each other in places like Chicago and Baltimore or Winnipeg or Toronto or any of the other cities you want to pick, are young men between 14 and 25 who do not have a good, solid father figure in the home. Now, I understand that not every father is a good figure. Some guys are just slugs. There's no arguing that. But as a general rule, having both mom and dad in the same house raising the children that they begat is a better system than one-parent families. I'm not putting down one-parent families, and I'm not saying they can't do a good job, but they're fighting an uphill battle because now either dad or mom has to be the other as well. So there's problems there that, again, we could spend hours talking about. But in a nutshell, I think Woodenhead's quite right that plays a big role.
Yeah. That might be a
Now,
nice segue actually into the new topic I was hoping to raise with the
okay.
apology of the Toronto police chief to the Black community. I don't think you and Joseph had a chance to touch on that subject last week, but
No,
it's
we didn't.
something as a person of color, I paid special attention to that story, and maybe if I read a little bit just to get people up to date if they hadn't had a chance. And I'm sure most of our listeners are probably aware of the story. Came out last week, I believe. It says Toronto's top cop apologizes to Black community for systemic discrimination in Interim Toronto Police Chief James Raymer apologized to the city's Black community after data from 2020 showed members of that community are far more likely to be subject to use of force by officers. This is a quote. There is systemic discrimination in our policing, Chief Raymer said. As an organization, we have not done enough to ensure that every person in our city receives fair and unbiased policing. A review of 949 interactions with police in 2020 showed that Black people are 2 times more likely to experience an enforcement interaction with officers. They are also 1.6 times more likely to experience force once involved in an enforcement interaction. And say, well, okay, they throw that stat out and use that as part of the basis of an apology. But one of the things, and I saw this report last week, I was watching it on TV, I saw it on Global, CTV Local News, and CBC. And when they give you those stats, they don't say, well, were people of that community actually more likely to be involved in crimes? No, they just throw the stat out there saying they've been in many more interactions, which might be true, but what caused those interactions? I mean, you just can't throw out that number. Looked at again, they are 1.6 times more to experience force. Well, that depends on what the call was for, right? As a policeman, you don't go out really looking for trouble. I mean, you get a call. They say go to a certain place, and there's a robbery or a domestic dispute, and then you intervene. So, in order for those statistics to really show racism, you have to actually look at the number of interactions altogether and how many calls were they called to, and were they called to twice as many Black households as white households? They don't tell you in that stat. So it's kind of misleading.
Yeah, and that's the problem with playing the race card, is that by playing it, you skew the results. And I'm not, look, this is a very touchy subject, so I'm trying to treat it gently. But let's face it, when you look at who has the largest group of broken homes, who has the largest, who are the ones, who are the people involved in gangs? I'm not saying white kids never get involved in gangs. That would be incredibly naive and stupid to say. Of course they do.
Right.
But are the numbers the same? If you go to Chicago as an example, I know we're talking about Ontario and Canada, but let's say Chicago. The vast majority of these gangs are Black, and it's Black on Black violence. So when the police intervene, of course the numbers are going to be skewed. Is that the same thing here? Nobody wants to see this. I don't want to see some young kid, regardless of their skin tone, in handcuffs being loaded into the back of a car, or worse, on a stretcher being loaded into an ambulance. Right. Okay. Nobody wants to see that. This is the part I don't think people understand. It's because if somebody comes out and say, well, deserves them right, and uses some racial epithet, that's racism. Okay.
Right.
Because regardless of what color somebody is, we all bleed red. It doesn't matter. This is why I don't care about race. I could care less about race. The only thing I couldn't care less about race. What matters is merit. But the bottom line is here, when you as a police chief play the race card, now you're causing a whole bunch of problems that might not have existed, or you're not doing your job. You're falling into the Neville Chamberlain mindset of appeasement. Well, if I just be nice to them, maybe they won't be so violent. Sorry, it didn't work with Hitler, and it won't work with street gangs, because street gangs don't give a crap about laws. They have tariff they want to protect, and they have rival gangs trying to move into their territory. Gunfights break out because all of it's illegal. Everything they're doing, smuggling guns, prostitution, human trafficking, all this stuff, it's all illegal. And yet the cops won't deal with the source of the problem. And society won't deal with the root, which is what Woodenhead pointed out, I think, is a lot of broken homes where these kids come from.
I was going to bring it back to that. It's like, if you don't want your kids hassled by the police, if you bring your kids up properly, they're not likely to have interactions with the police. And I don't think in Toronto or any other city, cops are sitting around the corner just targeting people because they've got nothing else to do. There's another statistic in that story, and I'll see if I can, if I don't, that's okay. But
well, while you dig that statistic up, John's whispering in my ear that we have the Chiefs apology video ready to roll if you want it. So why don't we, John, if you want to play that, you go right ahead.
As an organization, we have not done enough to ensure that every person in our city receives fair and unbiased policing. And for this, as Chief of Police and on behalf of the service, I am sorry and I apologize unreservedly.
Jamil Javani here, columnist with the Toronto Sun, and I'm here to reject an apology. Yes, Chief Raymer of the Toronto Police Service has issued an apology to Black Canadians over new race-based data released that shows how police officers have been interacting with Black citizens, particularly when it comes to use of force incidents and strip searches. Now, there's some concerning data here, but the chief's apology is not about making things better. It's not about how we move forward in a way that balances real public safety issues with respect for all citizens, regardless of their race, color, or creed. No, this is a page out of the liberal elite playbook. Let me explain. You see, the chief has used the word systemic racism. In fact, the Toronto Police news release uses the term systemic racism twice to explain these racial disparities. And that is a term that reflects a worldview that is getting nothing done to help anybody, Black, white, or otherwise. Systemic racism is a term that liberal elites use as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Essentially, what it allows them to do is to say, there's racism, so they can virtue signal, look at us fighting all the racism, but then not actually hold a single person accountable. Because there is no individual racist that they want us to focus on. They want us to focus on the system. Yes, the unseen spirit of racism that is living within an organization's policies and practices. Don't believe me? Well, ask Chief Raymer. If Toronto police are so racist, who are the racists? And is he going to be firing any of them? Or is this just another way to placate liberal elites who love to turn every single problem of inequality into a racial narrative? And that's my concern. If you're giving these people a get out of jail free card, if you're allowing people to go out and say, well, there's racism, but we don't actually get to blame a single person, we blame the unseen spirit, then what actually gets accomplished by that? More than that, as you move further to the left on the political spectrum, you also get these hyper liberal activists who love using terms like systemic racism as well, because it allows them to condemn our entire society, to condemn our entire country. They use racial disparities as an indictment of capitalism, of Christianity, of our constitutional monarchy, of our entire history. Why exactly would Chief Raymer and the Toronto Police want to feed into those narratives by using the exact same language? It's troubling to me. And that's why I reject the apology. If you want to actually get things done, let's focus on ideas that might lead to solutions. For example, in the very same data that Toronto Police use to say there's systemic racism, you can see that white citizens are overrepresented in strip searches in Toronto as well, at the same rate as Black people. So is systemic racism to be used to explain why white people are being overrepresented in strip searches? Does that make sense to you? Maybe there are some class inequalities at play here that might be a better explanation. Or if the chief really does want to apologize for something, what about another racial disparity? What about the fact that Black men are disproportionately victims of violent crime? Is he going to apologize for that? That's a racial disparity that claims a lot of lives every year. See, the point I'm trying to get to here is that if we want to make our cities safer, if we want to make our communities better places for kids to grow up in, we actually need to talk about reality as it is and not try to make liberal elites happy. That's my problem with Chief Raymer's response to this data. There's some real issues that need to be reckoned with, but this isn't the way to get things done.
I couldn't agree with him more.
Yeah, that's
a great
comment.
clip.
Don't you agree?
Yep, absolutely. And he makes some points I hadn't considered. The other thing I was going to mention is by calling it systemic racism, is that not racism in and of itself? I mean, why would you care about the color of somebody's skin if they're breaking the law? They're breaking the law. That's all that matters.
That's right. That's all that matters. You're breaking the law.
Yeah.
But
so that just underlines the whole point that, you can apologize till your head falls off, but his point about how we can't hold anybody accountable. Okay. If there's that much racism, who are the racists and what are you going to do about it?
Right. Exactly.
He doesn't have to do anything else now because he's blamed it on this system. And I reject the idea that Canada is a racist country in the first place. I reject the idea that there's this systemic racism. I think the commentator, Jamel, I think his name was.
Jamel Giovanni, yeah.
Was quite right that this is the liberal elites, or the further over on the left you go, they want to condemn capitalism, Christianity, our whole country and its history.
Yeah.
And call it all bad, but they never give you any idea about what they would replace it with if it ever collapsed. Or if they do, it's a horror show. They want to bring in communism or some form of, watered down communism called socialism, all this stuff. And we all know how those kinds of things end. Look at Venezuela, look at the Soviet Union, look at North Korea, look at China. Nobody wants to go there, but that's where those policies lead. So this whole idea about and the other thing, and I'll let you back into this in a second, Chris. Sure. I am just sick to death of people apologizing for things they have no business apologizing for. I'm done with that. I mean, we apologize for everything. And it's part of our Canadian growing up, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry, which is fine on an individual basis. But for crying out loud, the next thing you know, they're gonna start to apologize to the Vikings because they died in Newfoundland.
Right. Yeah.
1,000 years ago. So they have to apologize to the Danes now because we didn't have a welcoming committee there.
Yeah. So getting back to some of the stats, and there's other stats that they have a whole 90-page report on this. But from what I understand, the only way you could get the stats is for every time a police officer has an interaction, they have to do a report, right? I'm not a cop, but I assume that every time there's an interaction, they have to do a report on that. And I remember watching the news story last week, and you could see in the news story a little score sheet, little piece of paper, and it had you could check off the box, was the person Black, Latino, Asian, whatever. So the police have to check that off every time they had an interaction.
I know what I do.
So if you're a policeman, this was in 2020, if you knew that you were going to answer a call and you were going to have to report on the ethnicity of the person that you were interacting with, why would you hassle somebody with dark skin, knowing that you're going to have to do a report on that later on and check off that box? Why would you purposely harass a person of color and be extra rough with them, knowing that it's going to go on your stats and on the record and make the whole police force look bad? That doesn't make sense.
If I'm the cop, I know exactly what I'd do, because the first thing is, when I come to that part of the report, I just tick off every box there is and say, you figure it out. Because, I'm just that kind of a contrarian, right? You want me to do that? Okay, I'll do it. Chick, 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 chick. Now you figure it out.
Yeah.
Because
my point is that, wouldn't that actually make it safer? Because if you was a cop, if you know that you have to check off the box and say this person was black, or what, I had an interaction with so and so and so and so, and this is the color, aren't you going to be more careful not to be,
of course,
not to hurt that person because of their color?
That makes sense, though.
It would make sense to be. You would think that they would be extra careful. Now, one of the things they talked about was, they said the cops were more likely to pull a gun on a black person as opposed to a white person. Once again, whenever a cop pulls his gun out of his holster, that's a serious thing. It's not like in the movies where they just pull it out and start shooting people, and you have to do a report on that. So once again, why would you pull your gun out and start waving it around to the person because of their skin color, knowing that that's going to go on your statistics? Why would you incriminate yourself that way? If as a cop, if you're pulling a gun, you have to go back to headquarters and prove to them why you drew your gun. There has to be a reason. You can't just draw it willy-nilly like that.
Yeah, this isn't Little House on the. This isn't the Chicken Ranch where the sheriff pulls his .357 out of his holster and fires shots in the air. Right. I'm dating myself. That's an old movie. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, the point you make some excellent points. Look, cops have enough on their plates. They don't need all the extra paperwork to pull their pistol, or their pistol. They don't use revolvers anymore that I know of. But that's a lot of paperwork just because they took it out of their holster. They're going to want to know why. Now, maybe it's something as simple as disposing of an injured animal inside of a road. But outside of that, if you have to use it in a human-on-human conflict, you better be justified. You better make sure that your life and or the life of someone you're trying to protect is in mortal danger, or you are going to have a hell of a time.
Yeah. So I would like to see an analysis from that same year as to how many calls they got, how many times did the police officer have to pull his or her gun, and what were the circumstances under which they had to pull their gun.
Yep.
Then that's the only way you could determine if it's racism, but you have to understand what the circumstances are before you look at that blanket stat and say, oh, well, twice as many of people of this color or that color. Well, what were the circumstances that led him to pull the gun? If you don't know that, the stat can be very misleading and very skewed and one-sided.
Well, stats are like numbers. There's an old saying, what is it? Figures don't lie, but liars can figure, or something like that.
Yeah.
And the same thing with statistics. I once had a guy call me up while I was still on terrestrial radio. We were talking about climate change or something like that. And he said, well, according to this chart I'm looking at, I said, chart? You want a chart? Hey, tell me what you want on the chart. I can make a chart. It's meaningless, in other words. You can make the stats say anything you want to by cherry picking out of what the statistics say, unless you take it as a whole in context. I have a saying I really like is, if you want to understand the role of context, just run into a room with 100 people in it and scream 42. And everybody looks at you like, what? Because they don't understand what the context is. Maybe that's a score of the Leaf game, 42-0 over Boston. Okay, maybe then they'd all get up and cheer. except for that one lonely Boston fan. But maybe it's how cold it is outside. Maybe that's how fast somebody drove down the street. Who knows? But until you give it context, it's meaningless. And that's why context matters. And when you have statistics and reports and all that stuff, you can look at it in climate change, you can look at it in COVID, you can look at it in crime stats. Unless you have the proper context, you have no understanding of what you're reading or what it means.
Yeah. And there's, in some Western provinces, that you hear the same thing about, the Indigenous community. We'll say, oh, the Indigenous community is overrepresented in the prison system in Manitoba, probably in Winnipeg. And there's, they make up 5% of the population, but they're 25% of the prison population. Well, once again, that's a sad statistic. And we wish it were lower, but were those people just picked up off the street for no reason? I don't think so. So
yeah.
Once again, what were the circumstances that led those people to be apprehended and incarcerated in the first place? You just can't say there's overrepresentation. Well, why?
Yeah, and that's what we have to get to. Maybe some of it is because some of those individuals, and it's not narrowed down to just the Native community, but some of those individuals may be addicts who are committing crimes, breaking enters and things like that to come up with money to continue to feed their habits. That's a whole different, show right there, how to deal with that. Maybe some people commit crimes of passion. Maybe some people, and I'm not, there's all kinds of different circumstances. And this is why the court system set up the way it is, to deal with nothing but the facts, one case at a time. We don't have mass trials. We don't have mass, convictions or executions or anything like that. We do it one at a time, gather the evidence. We're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, unless you're Tamara Leach and you end up being arrested down in Ottawa for leading what turns out to be a completely legal protest. When's her apology and apology and fat check coming from the government? I mean, they gave Omar Khadr how much money? $10 million. And he was a bona fide terrorist. So anyway, the point is that you have this situation where we have a court system built around the idea that the individual is innocent until we can prove otherwise.
Right.
And when you get away from that, now you've got real problems.
Yeah. And I would love to be able to sit down with that police chief who was apologizing and ask him, okay, well, if you're a police chief, I assume that you came up through the ranks and you were on the beat. So when you were in your patrol car with your buddies, were you looking for black people to harass just for the sake of harassing black people? He would probably say, oh, no, not me. I wasn't doing it. Was your buddy? No. Any of the guys that you work with? No, we weren't doing that. Well, then
so who was? Yeah, this isn't Georgia 1950.
Yeah.
This isn't. There's so much wrong with this, and it's why I hate these mass apologies, blanket state apologies, because they're meaningless. For one thing, the only time I've heard a Canadian politician apologize when it made sense was Stephen Harper when he apologized to the Chinese community for the head tax.
Right.
Well, the reason that made sense was because some of the people he was apologizing to actually suffered through the head tax, and it had a dramatic impact. So you had someone who's in a position of authority apologizing to people directly affected. Okay, I get that. Right. But apologizing for something happened 600 years ago? Are you crazy? Everybody's dead. It's been generations since. This is nothing but history. And yet you want me to apologize? And if I don't apologize, you're going to pull down a statue of our first prime minister, or of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, who gave us most, if not all, of our rights. You're going to do that? That makes sense?
Yeah. So,
all right. Speaking of making sense, it's time for another. Tonight is flying by. I want to get into the inflation story. We'll do that right after this break. You folks stay right there. We'll stay right here. And when we go through this, we'll be right back on the Nick and Joe Show.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
Okay, here we are back again. Time for the last half hour of the show. Man, it's flying by tonight, Chris.
It is. Yep, I'm having fun. And learning a lot too.
Yeah. Before we get into this next topic, I want to make a suggestion. I want to offer a piece of advice to the conservative, whoever wins the conservative leadership for the next campaign against the Trudeau Liberals. And I offer it out of for altruistic reasons. I want very little compensation, very modest fee. And that is a new campaign slogan. And I think that they should put out the slogan, gas, groceries, and grandkids. That's what we're fighting for. And they can have that. Once the check clears, I'll let them. I'm kidding, of course. But, but the idea is that's what matters right now. It's not the climate. It's not, it's not any other concern. The war with Denmark's over, by the way. So they settled that war, so we don't even have that to worry about anymore. But to me, those three things sum up what's the top of mind of every Canadian right now. Gas, if you were to transfer back to the imperial system, gas is $10 a gallon. $10 a gallon.
Wow.
Yeah. So if you had a 20-gallon tank, do the math. You know, that's 10. I can't get over it. $10 a gallon. And everybody's whining and crying. No kidding, because it costs now over $200 to fill a pickup truck.
Yeah.
My little Honda Fit is $60 to fill.
Yeah. Who would have thought that a year ago you'd be driving down the street like I did tonight, and like I think I saw a gas at $1.80 something, and I got
you got a break.
I got all excited, and it's like I'm getting excited because I see gas for $1.86 like a liter.
Insane.
Like that excites me now.
Well, you know what the gas here in Sioux Lookout, I just drove by the gas station the last day or so, $2.31.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's over $10 a gallon.
Right.
And people wonder why everybody's, looking at alternatives or whatever. But so all this to lead into what the government wants to do, because we're talking about inflation, because it's not just gas. Energy drives the cost of everything up. So the very first thing you have to do is get a grip on the price of energy, and you bring the price of energy down. Now, I know there's certain factors within the field of energy we don't have any control over. The price of oil on the open market, Look, I get that. But the government has a huge role to play in things like regulation, in the things like how many pipelines we can build, how many refineries are operating, how many, go down the list, how much tax is leveled against every unit of energy. All these kind of things. $1.91 at Costco.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah.
But the point I'm making is the government can't control the price of oil, but it's about the only thing they can't control. Everything else follows under their purview. So if they really cared about $2 a gallon gas or $2 a liter, $10 a gallon gas, then they could do things like, I don't know, how about Energy East pipeline? How about, putting an LNG plant in Newfoundland and one in Victoria or somewhere on the West Coast, encouraging companies to come back to Canada and begin to drill and put in, either take refineries out of mothballs and get them producing gasoline and your heavier fuels, because part of the reason why it's so high is because demand is outstripping supply. It's supply and demand. So you want the price to come down, you make more of it, and that will bring the price down. Like if there's only one loaf of bread and you and I both want it, okay, we have to duke it out amongst ourselves about who's going to pay who's going to pay the highest price for that loaf of bread. But if there's 1,000 loaves, we don't care.
I assume that's why the gas was so cheap 2 years ago, at the summer of 2020. Remember, we were buying gas at like 65 cents a liter or something like that. And so I guess that makes sense. It's like nobody was driving anywhere. So,
well, who's in control of most of the energy within North America 2 years ago?
Who was what?
Who was actually running the show concerning energy in North America 2 years ago? Who was that?
The president, I think his name was Trump.
That's the guy. They were energy independent, and we were benefiting from that.
Yeah.
Now you've got Sleepy Joe down there shutting down, doing his best to shut down the domestic oil production industry. And now gas prices are through the roof. You can't blame it on Putin. You can't blame it on China, because all these things were taking place before any of that stuff happened.
Exactly.
All right. So let me share with the listener a couple of paragraphs out of his speech, and then I'm going to play a clip. It's relevant. But first, here's what our government, this is the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland. It's not Christina.
Chrystia Freeland.
Chrystia, there we are. Yeah. Chrystia Freeland. I'm blending words is what I'm doing. And she gave a speech, and I've taken a few extracts from the speech, or excerpts from the speech. And she's talking about what they're going to do about it. So here, and I've just, like I said, I've pulled a few out. This isn't the whole speech, but you can go and find it online. It's not hard. First, the pandemic. The shift in demand from services to goods. Who wrote this? From services to goods it triggered, and the resulting supply chain snarls, which I heard about very personally just this morning at a family-run hardware store in my neighborhood. China's COVID-0 policies have made these worse. Really? Then Vladimir Putin illegally invaded Ukraine, forcing up the price of food and fuel. Here in Canada and around the world, that means higher prices at the checkout counter and higher prices at the gas pumps. Canada doesn't have a say in Beijing public health measures, and we clearly aren't consulted when the Kremlin makes its war plans. All right, stop. First of all, this is right out of Biden's playbook. Instead of accepting responsibility, they're blaming everyone but themselves, because none of what she just said is true. The war in Ukraine happened after. It has nothing to do, if we had our own domestic supply, it wouldn't matter what Russia does, we could still have cheap oil. It did nothing about the price of food, okay, other than you might argue, well, the port at Odessa, where a lot of the wheat comes from the Ukraine to feed the world food market, was in jeopardy, but it never did close that I know of. So then she says, Canada and around the world, higher prices are checked out. No. These are domestic problems. And this is right out of Biden's playbook. Again, they're blaming everybody but themselves. It's their policies that caused all this. Okay, back to the speech. A labor shortage and workers with the right skills is constraining the world's industrialized economies. Canada is no exception. Addressing this shortage is one of the fundamental goals of our April budget. Our plan to do so is part of a set of measures that Janet Yellen, the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, whom I'll be have the pleasure of welcoming to Canada on Monday, has described as modern supply economics. Okay. Using Secretary Yellen as a source of advice should be a huge red flag. She's in complete denial and thinks that things are getting better, not worse. Not the kind of person you want to have helping balance your checkbook. So, John, if you've got that video, I want to play the listener a clip of, it's only about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes long, of Secretary Yellen talking to U.S. Congressional Committee about inflation and about energy and all that. She's the financial secretary. So this is who we're going to draw intelligent, advice from. This is what Chrystia Freeland thinks is a good source. So go ahead and roll the clip.
Past year and a half, we've experienced a robust recovery characterized by strong economic growth, historically low unemployment, and high household saving rates.
Okay, stop it there, John. Don't make the clip go away, but I just want to make a point. Everything she said there is a flat out lie. A robust economy? Are you kidding? We're on the verge of a recession. Everything she said in that whole first clip is nothing but a flat out lie. Go ahead and continue it.
The volume was kind of low for me, Nick.
I know.
Has been buttressed by the congressional response to the challenges of the pandemic, beginning with the CARES Act at the beginning of the pandemic and continuing with the Consolidated Appropriations Act in late 2020 and the American Rescue Plan legislated at the beginning of 2021. As President Biden said last week, we now are entering a period of transition from one of historic recovery to one that can be marked by stable and steady growth.
Okay, stop it again. Again, she's in complete denial. In the United States, gas is $5 or $6 a gallon. For them, when Trump was in office, it was $2. Now it's $5 or $6. And that was only 2 years ago, before the Ukrainian war. So they cannot blame it on that. This is who we're supposed to listen to. This is why I'm playing this clip. Go ahead and finish it off.
Piece of the president's plan to get inflation under control without sacrificing the economic gains we've made. We also managed to avert the far worse outcomes that were forecast at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. After the onset of the pandemic, CBO forecast that unemployment would exceed 9% in 2021. Now we're experiencing historically low unemployment. We're also witnessing sharp reductions in the budget deficit, with CBO recently forecasting the largest nominal reduction to the federal deficit in history. According to their projections, the deficit as a share of the economy this year will be at a lower level than CBO projected before the American Rescue Plan passed. Still, we currently face macroeconomic challenges, including unacceptable levels of inflation, as well as the headwinds associated with the disruptions caused by the pandemic's effect on supply chains and the effects of supply-side disturbances to oil and food markets resulting from Russia's war in Ukraine. To dampen inflationary pressures without undermining the strength of the labor market, an appropriate budgetary stance is needed to complement monetary policy actions by the Federal Reserve.
Okay. First of all, even if she's right about historic job, growth, it doesn't matter, because if you're not making enough to counter inflation, you're still going backwards. Before Biden became president, if you were living on $15 or $20 an hour, okay, and inflation was 1 or 2%, Okay. You might not be filthy rich, but you were making ends meet. Now making the same amount of money, but inflation running at 8, 9%, maybe higher, all of a sudden you're going backwards. And that's what's wrong with this. This is why we cannot take advice from this woman. She doesn't know, or she either doesn't know or is willing to lie through her teeth about the reality that North Americans are facing. So for Chrystia Freeland to take advice from her should be a huge red flag. This is what's wrong. You cannot spend. Winston Churchill had a great saying: spending your way out of a deficit is like standing in a bucket and trying to lift yourself out by the handle. It doesn't work. It never has.
No. And how do all these words and speeches by bureaucrats help the poorest of the poor in the United States or Canada? So if you're living on the minimum wage or just slightly above minimum wage and you have rent to pay and groceries to buy, it's great to have these bureaucrats giving these wonderful speeches, but that's not going to help people put food on their table.
Well,
as Reagan said, government's not the solution. It's usually the problem. And I think that's the case in this instance.
You must have been reading my mind. I was just, because, look, I'm not saying there's no role for government in the economy, but this isn't it. You cannot stimulus your way out of the problem. There are studies out now, and I wish I'd have thought of this before, I'd have pulled them up, but studies out now that's saying the spending that FDR did back in the 30s, the stimulus package, they didn't call it that then. It was the chicken in every pot deal that he spent, actually made the Depression last longer. That had he not done that, they would have recovered faster, because the market always responds faster than the government does. And that's why this doesn't work. It's why price controls don't work. We talked about the price of daycare. Being at $10, they're going to cap it at $10 a day, or you're going to only have to spend $10. Who's making up the difference, right? It's going to be you and I, because that bill still has to be paid. Now, their answer, stimulus spending, is just to print more money. Just churn it out, churn it out, churn it out. The problem with that is, going back to the loaf of bread analogy, the single loaf of bread is worth $10 when there's only you and I bidding for it. Okay? Right. Or if there's 1,000 people bidding for it, one loaf of bread. But if there's 10,000 loaves of bread, then they're only worth 30 or 45, maybe $1 a piece. You bring the price down by increasing supply to satisfy demand.
Right.
And that is only done and best done by the private sector. If you keep churning out money, okay, each dollar becomes less valuable because there's more of it. So stop printing money.
Exactly. And it's just this vicious circle, because, everybody wants to make more and everybody wants to be ahead of the guy next door. But it's for some for unions, I get some emails from the Canadian Labor Congress and whatnot, and I skim over them. But I know that their answer is, well, we got to pay the workers more to keep up. But that's not really the answer, because the more money people make, then it's still the same problem. It's like you're making more money, but then the cost of your service goes up, and then the other guy has to pay more for your service. So it becomes this vicious cycle, which we cannot get out of. I have never, in my career, I've been on strike a few times as a public servant, but I was more concerned with how can I move my career forward and move up the ladder to make more money, as opposed to just give me more money because I need more money. It's like, if you want to make more money, then get a job, earn more money, get more education or whatever. But once again, just giving people higher salaries isn't going to help, because then the cost of the product or the service you're providing goes up.
It's a vicious circle. Yeah. I was listening to a multimillionaire give his advice on YouTube the other day, and he said, look, the best way to make more money, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, he said, work for free. And he didn't mean that as it sounds. He said, you have to stop thinking like an employee. What we need to do, I'm extrapolating from what he had to say, was to encourage more people to become entrepreneurs and to begin to educate themselves about money, what debt is, what real money is, what real assets are, and learn about taxes, debt, and money. And you learn that not in school. You learn that from your accountant, from your lawyers, from your real estate agents, from the people who are real teachers about finance. And when you understand those lessons, then you will be able to solve your own financial crises. You won't need the government. And that's why the government doesn't want to teach economics in school. Because if we figure out how to look after ourselves, what do we need them for?
Yeah, the best, I've heard this years ago. They say the best economy is the one where people are working and spending on small businesses. So you want the dollars to circulate within the economy. You don't want the government printing the money, but you want people exchanging the money as much as possible, which is one of the reasons why and I'm sure you too, I'm not that crazy about the minimum wage.
No, I'm not either.
Because let's think about it. There are people, I don't think the minimum wage is like 14.50 right now. So on the way back from my mom's home, for example, tonight, I see a guy at the corner of Smythe and Saint Laurent, and he's by the median, begging for money, which is kind of dangerous because you really shouldn't be on the street, going up to cars on the busy intersection begging for money. But supposing I had like a landscaping business or something, and I said to that guy, look, instead of sitting on the street begging, how much I'll come work for me landscaping. I can only pay you $10 an hour, but 8 hours a week, $80, 80 times 5, it's like $400 a week. So even if I said, would you like to work for $10 an hour for me? If the guy said yes, by law, I can't pay him that salary, even though he might want to work for that salary. So it doesn't make sense. Like if we allowed people to, employers to pay what they wanted to pay, you'd have more people working and less people on the street begging. So
yeah, well, the best motivator, one of the best motivators for people is hunger. If they get hungry enough, they'll work. That's why workfare doesn't work. That's why social welfare programs just trap people in an endless cycle of poverty. But I got to come back to this idea about how people need to re-educate themselves about what real money is and how to earn it. And if you can become financially, I'll say independent. Not everybody needs to be a multimillionaire, although I think we should, I'm certainly not opposed to somebody becoming, I wouldn't mind being one, because those kind of people really do drive the economy. I've used the yacht analogy before to demonstrate how people who make multi-million dollars a year and buy multi-million dollar yachts, as an example, put far more into the economy than people buying a $20,000 car do, because of all the spin-offs that come from that. And it's just, we need to understand financial success is something to be lauded, not punished, and stop being envious about somebody else's lifestyle. Rather than being envious, go try and earn a lifestyle like that for yourself. There's only one way to do that. Take a risk, go out and make mistakes. What's that old Miss Frizzle line from School Bus? Get dirty, take chances, take a risk.
Well,
God,
that's
I
why
hated that show.
The last 2 years have been so devastating for the economy because of the business shutdowns. And I used to work in a large office complex, and you go downstairs, and it's kind of like a mini shopping center in the building I worked in. And there was a big food court with about 15 different places you go to have lunch or have a snack. There was a dollar store, a drug store, a few women's dress shops, and different coffee shops. And I haven't been in the building since the pandemic, but most of those places are closed now. Some of them were actually closing before the pandemic. But it breaks my heart to see all those businesses disappeared, not because of the pandemic, but because of the way the government regulations regarding the pandemic. Last week, about a week ago, we went down to Eddy Street in Quebec to celebrate my friend's brother's birthday, and he wanted to go to this health food store on Eddy Street on the Gatineau side. And as we were driving down Eddy Street, it was just heartbreaking to see all these stores that were boarded up, including one of my favorites when I used to work in Gatineau. There was a Giant Tiger store not too far from where I worked. And you walk by there now, it's well boarded up and
Giant
cobwebs.
Tiger?
Giant Tiger, yeah, in Gatineau.
Wow.
And I went, as I walked by there, we were driving by and I thought, there's the Giant Tiger I used to go to, and it's all boarded up. And I was thinking, that place used to do really well when government workers were walking around at lunch. We'd go down there and shop. And it was just like, drive down Eddy Street sometime in Gatineau, and it's just heartbreaking. And
Well, I wish we had the time to get into the culture that the government's developed by this lockdown about how people now are reluctant to go back into the workforce because they've been living at home, learning how to work from home, and the impact that's had on our economy. We don't have time for that now. The show's almost over, but wow, what a difference that's made. Because how many times, sorry?
So who wants to be an entrepreneur now? Like, would you want to open up a restaurant now, knowing that the government could shut you down the next time there's a pandemic?
Well, that's part of the problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right, Chris, guess what that means? We don't really have time to get in anything else, so we're going to say our good nights. It's been a pleasure seeing you again. I've certainly enjoyed the show. Thank you very much for joining me this evening.
Thank you. I didn't know there was a hockey game on. I forgot their hockey was on. I should have said no.
I forgot all about it. I was so interested in the show, I forgot about the game. All right.
Probably just starting now.
Yeah, well, let's hope. Anyway, thanks again, Chris. And to all of you, I wish you all a great week, and we'll see you all again next week. Same place, same time. Ubi caritas et amor. Dea CBS. Good evening. God bless. Don't let anything disturb your peace, and may you have a fair wind in a following sea.